All right, good morning. My name is Mark Erickson, and today I am excited to talk to you about the state of React and the community in 2025. A couple quick things about myself. I am a senior engineer at Replay. I am an answer of questions. I will answer questions about React and Redux and JavaScript pretty much anywhere there's a text box on the internet. I moderate the React subreddit and the React Flux Discord. I collect all kinds of useful and interesting links. We talk about them in places like the This Month in React podcast. I write extremely long blog posts, and I am a Redux maintainer. I've written a lot of our docs, and I created a Redux toolkit. But a lot of people know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar. It's become my trademark. Okay, I have a lot of things to talk about. I could talk about these topics for multiple hours, and I've got 33 minutes and 4 seconds. So I'm going to have to summarize a lot of things. I could go into more detail, and I'll have to limit it for sake of time. There are a lot of intertwined topics, and I can only cover so many of them in here. I will try to cite some sources for some of this information. In other cases, you'll have to trust that I've done the research, and I'll try to provide some links at the end. I do have a version of the slides online, my blog, blog.isquaredsoftware.com, as well as a blog post that goes into a lot of additional detail. But overall, this is my attempt to provide some explanations as best as possible based on my own understanding. I'll probably get a few things wrong, but I think I've got the history of things pretty accurate. So what is the state of React today? The answer is it's kind of complicated, actually. React is by far the most widely used JavaScript framework. It's huge. Large portions of the ecosystem are using it. Next.js is by far the most widely used individual JavaScript framework and build tool. The React ecosystem is huge. In fact, a lot of people pick React because there's so many different libraries and packages and articles and information available. Even individual React libraries like React Router are downloaded more often than other entire JavaScript frameworks. And React has had a huge influence on the ecosystem. Like all the other frameworks have converged on the idea of components and props and reusability. Suspense has popped up in other frameworks like Solid. A lot of times UI libraries are built for React first and then ported to other frameworks. So React is doing great at a technical level. And we finally had React 19 come out earlier this year. Granted, it did take 2.5 years for it to finally come out after all the work from React 18, but it was a really big deal. It introduced stable suspense and the new React server component support for real. There were new client-side features like the use hook for officially triggering suspense, a lot of new form methods. We even had React 19.2 come out just a couple days ago with the new activity component built in. The React team has also been working on the new React compiler, which promises to make performance a lot better. It'll catch a lot of common mistakes. That's in release candidate. It's almost ready to go. So from a technical level, React and the ecosystem are doing great. Unfortunately, it's about more than just the technology. React is a community. And I spend a lot of time reading comments and interacting with people online and obsessing over social media too much and reading entirely too many discussions. And I've seen a lot of angst and frustration and confusion. A lot of people don't understand why is React going in certain technical directions. Why is the React team choosing to work on certain features? What are the motives behind building things like server components? And so there actually appears to be a bit of a split between the way people think the React team wants them to use React versus how a lot of teams are still actively using React in practice. And that doesn't even begin to touch on things like arguments over, is React itself even a good idea? Should you be using React versus web components? Use the platform? And I'm not even touching that argument. That's a whole separate topic that we're not going to touch today. But one of the things I've seen is that everybody is arguing over a different subset of problems. And so there's all this angst and frustration and confusion, but it's kind of hard to have a conversation when some people are arguing about this and some people are arguing about that, and we can't even have a decent conversation about it. Some of the complaints that I've seen, one of the most common ones is that Vercel has taken over React and they invented server components just to make money off of selling servers. A lot of people don't understand why server components exist, or they seem over-engineered. Why do you even need a framework or a bundler to use these server components? I've even seen comments like, React on the client might stop working someday, or that React only works with Next. There's also been a lot of confusion about why is the React team encouraging everybody to use frameworks? Why are they pushing this on us so hard? And I've seen people claim that the React team must hate Vite or hate single-page applications and so on and so on. So my goals, like a lot of these are honestly just like at best misunderstandings, or at worst, they are fear, confusion, doubt. And I want to be very clear. The React team is not responsible for a lot of this confusion or these claims going around the ecosystem. But it's also true that sometimes the communication from the React team has made it harder to understand why they're doing things. I think they're on a lot of topics, they really haven't explained why they're doing things on the blog or in the docs. There's a lot of discussions on social media where they've answered questions, but that never makes it into the docs. And then some of the recommendations in the docs haven't really matched how people are actively using React in practice. So again, like it's not the React team's fault people are confused, but I think the lack of communication in some cases has not helped make things better. So, goals for today, we're going to do a history lesson. I'm a big fan of understanding how we got here and what were the influences and what was the process. So we're going to go back and look at some of the history and influences on React's development, try to explain what is actually driving the React team, why are they going in certain directions. We're going to look at a couple different places where I think there are disconnects between the directions the team wants to go and where the community has been. And we're going to try to address some of these concerns. I don't have any particular dog in this fight. I don't even use server components on a day-to-day basis. I'm not part of the React team, but I moderate communities. I answer questions. I want people to discuss things in good faith and have like real discussions about trade-offs and best practices rather than having stupid arguments. So this is my attempt to address some of the actual confusion. So if we go all the way back, when React first came out in 2013, it was a very small library. In fact, it was even described early on as being just the view layer in a model view controller type of an architecture. And you could even use it with something like backbone models or even integrate it into like an Angular 1 application. And React has always been very unopinionated. If React itself is supposedly just the view layer, you can use it almost anywhere. And as a result, React has grown into a huge ecosystem. There are dozens of libraries for anything you would want to do. State management, styling, data fetching, routing, you name it, you have a ton of libraries for every possible use case. And the React team has always avoided trying to provide recommendations for which libraries you ought to use. And part of that is that Facebook, or Meta these days, has always had their own internal infrastructure for data fetching and routing and serving and everything else. So they didn't need React Router or Redux or a lot of the tools that we use in the ecosystem. But they also wanted to avoid the appearance of playing favorites. Now, React's giant ecosystem, it means that when you start up an application, you end up picking data, state management and a router and styling and everything. And this is a strength. You get to customize your app for what you need. It's also a bit of a weakness because you have to spend all this time choosing tools. And so it can lead to paralysis analysis and too much choice. Now, if you go back to the early days of React, React has always been used with a build tool like Webpack and Babel for compiling the JavaScript. And in the first couple years, that meant that most tutorials started by spending multiple pages just telling you how to configure Webpack and Babel properly, and you don't even get to write your first line of React code until like halfway down the tutorial. And so the React team eventually put together a new project called Create React App, a command line tool that can run one command and generate a whole new project from scratch that already has a good Webpack and Babel config. And this was genuinely a really big deal. It meant that you could start a project very simply, you didn't have to worry about Webpack, and you could also have a tutorial that just said, step 1, use Create React App, start a new project, and now let's talk about React, instead of having to spend all this time configuring build tools. And so CRA was a big deal, but it also only generated client-side single-page applications. Now, React has also never had a built-in data fetching method. And so it's been pretty typical over the years to use libraries like Redux or Apollo or React Query to do all your data fetching. React has always had a built-in way to do server-side rendering. Originally, it was just render a component tree to a string. Later, you could do things like node streams. But the process of setting up SSR was really complicated. And so part of the early reason people began to adopt other frameworks was because they made SSR setup built-in and easier to deal with. So Next introduced things like file-based routing or being able to prefetch data for the whole page. Gatsby gave us static site generation based on a big GraphQL data layer. Treat all your data sources as GraphQL. Remix gave us the server-side loader pattern and pushed for using more HTML-based conventions for working with React. And so these frameworks all began to simplify the process of doing more than just client-side applications. But overall, if you look at, say, 2015 to 2020, I would say that a single-page application has been the most common way to use React. That your whole page, your whole app is rendered in a single div on the client side, fetch some JSON, and go from there. And so I think a lot of folks have traditionally seen server-side rendering as just the thing that you do if you need some better search engine optimization. And also, because React is JavaScript, in order to do SSR, you really need to be running a Node server on the back end, but a lot of projects don't even have Node on the back end. They've got Python or Java or some kind of, they might even have enterprise restrictions that you're not allowed to run a Node server. In the last few years, we have seen more of a shift in the ecosystem, more of a push towards using SSR as much as possible to give us faster page loads or fewer request waterfalls because you can do all the fetching on the server. And that might even result in less JavaScript being shipped to the client. Now, Create React App came out back in, I think, 2016. And it was a really big deal for about 5-ish years or so. But by 2021, 2022, the project was actually becoming unmaintained. It took a long time for Create React App to be updated to work with Webpack version 5. And by that time, the maintainers of the project didn't even work at Facebook anymore. And eventually, someone filed an issue saying that we should actually declare that CRA is dead and recommend that people use other tools instead. And eventually, Dan Abramov wrote a very long comment saying, yeah, the React team thinks that CRA is actually outdated at this point. And we're not yet sure what the best way is to replace it. Maybe we should kill the project entirely. Maybe we should turn it into something else. But we do think CRA is obsolete. But they never actually officially announced that CRA is dead. You kind of had to read this one giant GitHub thread for the discussion. And it was kind of okay, because the community had already mostly begun to move on to Vite for single-page applications. So if you look at the number of downloads and popularity today, Next is definitely the most popular tool for starting up a new project, and it can do everything. Server-side rendering, static site gen, client-side applications, server components. The combination of Remix and React Router is extremely widely used. A lot of people are still on older versions of React Router, but the new React Router version 7 has a lot of built-in methods for data fetching and even a Vite plugin for framework mode. If you look at Vite's React plugin, that is extremely widely used, and Create React app is still out there and seeing a lot of downloads. People probably aren't starting new projects with it today, but a lot of existing projects are still using it, and it's still mentioned in a lot of tutorials. One thing I do want to note is if you look at the downloads and you combine the Vite React plugin and Create React app, it is actually more widely used than Next.js based on downloads, which tells you that there's a lot of people who still want to build single-page applications with React. So, also jumping into the Wayback Machine. The React team first gave us the suspense component back in 2018. But originally it was very limited. The only thing that you could use it for was lazy loading React components. And so they promised us that eventually you'll be able to use this for data fetching somehow, someday. There will probably be some kind of built-in caching feature eventually. And so for years, people were waiting for suspense for data fetching, hoping that it'll show up. It never did quite arrive. But the React team gave us something else. And so in late 2020, they announced the first prototype of a new feature they were calling React Server Components, the ability to run a component on the server. The component can be async, which means you can do a data fetch from an API or the database inside, and you can pass that data as props to a component that shows up on the client. And this really had a couple different purposes. It was intended to be a built-in React way to do data fetching, and it was supposed to be bundle optimization. So if you have like a heavy library, like a markdown renderer or something, you can do that rendering on the server and just pass the output to the client, and the library never even makes it into the client bundle. And timeline-wise, I want to point out that at this point, the entire React team was still working at Meta. Now, React's development process has always heavily relied on being able to alpha test new features inside of Meta internally. So the React team would come up with an idea, put together a proof of concept, talk to some feature teams at Meta, have them try it out. Okay, that prototype doesn't work. Let's iterate on the idea a few more times. And so by the time any new feature was actually released to the general public, it had already been refined and improved, and the React team's pretty sure this is the API we want to ship, and we're very sure it's stable and good to go. The React team does have to spend a good amount of time supporting Meta as a whole, but they have the ability to decide, here are the features and the concepts that we want to work on and the directions we want to push the React's development. And again, it's worth noting that Meta has its own internal infrastructure, so they rarely need the same kind of third-party libraries to build apps that we do in the ecosystem. And so this is where Vercel starts to enter the picture. Vercel, their primary business is web app hosting. They've always been involved with React. Guillermo wrote a post back in 2014 or 2015 where he talked about the use of React as pure UI. They build the Next framework. They obviously make it very easy to deploy Next on their own infrastructure, but it is a node server, and with some adapters, you can deploy it to other places. And so in late 2021, the React team lead, Sebastian Markbaga, was the first React core team member to leave Meta, and he went over to Vercel. And they hired some additional folks like Tom Aquino and Andrew Clark, and they began actually paying people as part of the React core team to continue working on React, as well as the server component and Next integration. So today, if you look at the React team page in the docs, there's 20-ish people, and about 15 of them are at Meta, and 5 are at Vercel. Plus, there's all the folks who are focusing on React Native at Meta. And in general, the React team folks at Vercel are focused on server components and a lot of the core rendering logic, and the team at Meta is focused more on the compiler and view transitions and a lot of other features like that. But despite being split across 2 different companies, they are one team in terms of where they're trying to go and what they're trying to work on. They shifted what companies they're at and what offices they're in, but still the same people working together on the same things. So overall, Next became the first production implementation of React server components. The React core team members were building functionality into React. They were working directly with a lot of the Next team members on designing the app router and building out its functionality. But it's also true that Next has had some teething problems with the release of server components. A lot of people, myself included, would say that they probably pushed it from being beta to stable a little too soon. There have been a lot of issues that were specific to Next. They've gone through multiple iterations on how do you handle caching and things like that. It's made it a little hard to figure out, like, is this a React bug? Is this a Next bug? There's also been a lot of packages, including React Redux, that broke in server component environments because now you have to account for more bundle combinations, more build system different settings. And while the Next docs did a great job of saying, here's how you use the app router and work with it, the core docs have never really covered how do you use server components properly. So, speaking of the React docs, hooks were announced in late 2018 and delivered in early 2019. It was very exciting, and the community began to adopt hooks very quickly. I think in some cases faster than the React team expected. And so for a while there was a bit of a disconnect where the community has already jumped on using hooks, but the docs were still teaching class components as the default. And there was this whole other section of explaining hooks as like a secondary API. And so it wasn't until late 2020 that the React team said, okay, we're going to rewrite the docs, we're going to teach function components and hooks as the default, and we're going to try to improve the explanations in the tutorial. And it was a very long effort. It took them at least 2.5 years to ship the brand new doc site, react.dev. And react.dev is genuinely wonderful. It's awesome. I love it. We used to have to tell people to go to other tutorials to get started learning React. And now we can just say, just go straight to react.dev, start with the docs, read the tutorial, start to finish. It's awesome. Genuinely love it. The explanations are so much better. But it also still barely covers server components at all. Now, when the new docs site came out, and you look at the pages that talk about how to get started with a brand new React project, the new docs site changed the recommendations. The old site said, if you want to build a single page application, use Create React App. If you want to do a static site, use Gatsby. If you need some SSR, use Next. But the new site changed both the list of tools and the phrasing that it used. And it really began to put this big emphasis on React frameworks, 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 frameworks everywhere. And a framework, in this case, is a built-in React toolset that has routing and data fetching and SSR all built in. And initially, the new docs said use Next or Gatsby or Remix. They didn't mention Create React App at all, which, okay, makes sense because by this time Create React App is basically dead. But it also didn't list Vite at all. And the React team began to make a lot of statements saying, we think everybody, all React devs, should be using frameworks. And this actually kind of started to confuse people. Like, why isn't Vite listed in the docs as an option? And why is Next listed first? And why do they seem to be pushing Next so much? And so this push for frameworks started to become something of a flashpoint in the discussions. So let's do some myth busting. By far the most common complaint I've seen is people claiming that Vercel has taken over React, and they invented server components just to make money off of web hosting and selling servers. I understand why people have said this, but in the nicest form, it's a misunderstanding, and it's much more of a conspiracy theory. Please stop saying this. It's not accurate. Server components were invented by the React team, not Vercel. Really, server components are an attempt to generalize everything they've seen with Meta's own internal infrastructure, being able to do code splitting and loading chunks of the app on demand, being able to do data fetching. Meta relies heavily on GraphQL, and that's pretty specific, but if you look at it, server components can do a lot of the same kinds of things GraphQL can do. But unlike all the previous features, the React team really couldn't alpha test this properly at Meta because Meta doesn't need server components. They already have their own infrastructure. So ultimately, the React team went out and talked to Vercel, and they convinced Vercel to do what the React team wanted to build, to invest and be the sponsor. Dan Abramov said that, look, Vercel has paid a lot of engineers to build what the React team wanted to build. If anything, it's more like the React team took over Next's direction than Vercel telling the React team what to do. Now, like I said, I can understand how people drew some of these conclusions. Vercel has obviously invested a lot of money in React's development. They paid for the app router implementation. They employ a bunch of React team members. They benefit from having the React folks and the Next folks, essentially sitting next to each other and talking. And it is true that the React team and Next team work together very closely, that the React team, or the React docs list Next as a recommended tool. Next was the first build tool to have server components built in. They've had announcements where they were the first one, they were able to say, we're the first ones that have new React features available. There's even been confusion because React has had some features that were not quite ready officially, and they've put out these pre-release canary builds for use by frameworks. And so any framework could make use of them, but Next has heavily relied on using the canary builds. And so a lot of people have questioned, like, if it's not official, if it's not ready yet, how does Next get to use it? But any framework could have used these. The React team has tried to get other teams involved in the process. Shopify's Hydrogen team was involved in a lot of the early design discussions. There were talks with the Remix team about trying to use them, and ultimately the Remix team opted not to get involved in server components right away. So Vercel invested, and Next was able to use them early on. Now, we even heard yesterday, like, server component support is coming out more broadly. Waku is available. Parcel has shipped. React Router version 7 just announced better server component support. So the key points I want to make. Server components were not invented by Vercel. They were a React team idea, and they are not unique to Next. I also see a lot of questions about, like, why do server components need a bundler? The existing SSR methods were just functions you can call anywhere, like in an express endpoint. And really the answer is it's complicated at a technical level. Server components are a React feature, but they don't do anything until they're integrated into a bigger bundler and a framework. And that's because they are really based on build time bundling and transformations. Daishi Kato, who spoke yesterday, did a great talk at React Advanced a couple years ago, where he talked about some of the process of being able to parse the files, find the client and server directives, and split it into two copies of the module graph, one for the server and one for the client. And it has to integrate into routers so that you know when you go to this route, we also need to prefetch these pieces of the component tree. And so React provides all these pieces, but it's up to the framework to decide where and how they actually get integrated. And part of the problem is we've seen Next and the app router, but they made a lot of very specific design choices that aren't built into the server component concept. And so other tools like Parcel and Waku have made very different choices, and we just haven't seen that enough to know the difference. Also, one of the biggest points of confusion, despite the name, server components do not require a running node server to use the technology. I'll be honest, I think server components was actually a very bad name. I wish we could go back and change that name. I like to think of them as serialized components, because it's really a component serializing the props and sending them down to the client side. You can use server components in a build step. In fact, right now, with the next app router, when you do the initial build, all those files in the app router will generate first the JSON output, and then it gets built into HTML. You can even do a full SPA with Next. So, despite the name, server components do not require a literal running node server in order to use them. Running out of time, so moving quickly. There's some really bad conspiracy theories out there. I've seen people claim that React only works with Next, or that React will somehow stop working on the client side. I shouldn't even have to say it. Those are obviously wrong. All of React's existing functionality will continue to work exactly the same way, indefinitely, even in future versions. In fact, React 19 even added a bunch of new client-side only features. You can use React for a single page app, SSR, SSG, one route, many routes in an existing page. None of these things are going to change. All of the new server component functionality is entirely optional. Having said that, it has had an impact on the ecosystem. People see the new functionality, they see the React team encouraging people to use it, and they make the assumption that maybe at some point this will be the only way that React works. And as things change, you do have to kind of keep up. So there's the assumption that if there's a new feature, I have to use it. And we have seen things like CSS and JS libs start to go away because server component environments don't really have full support for context. So what about this whole frameworks thing? It's not because of Vercel, it's not because the React team hates Vite. The React team has been very clear why they push this, but there is some confusion. So they said, we think all React devs should be using frameworks. Routing, bundling, data fetching, all these pieces are very interconnected. And I've had some conversations with the React team where they said, we've actually heard a lot of the external criticism that React apps are too slow or the bundle sizes are too big. And we think that choosing a framework as the default way to build a React app will usually lead to better performance out of the box, as well as a better developer experience, because you don't have to spend time picking and choosing all the pieces. So overall, their stance is that frameworks have all these pieces built in, you don't have to spend time picking and choosing, better performance by default. And if server components require integration into a framework anyway, then by having a framework, at least you have the choice to use it if you want to. So I think there's actually a lot of very good reasons why they've encouraged this, but it also doesn't entirely match how everybody or a lot of folks are using React. Single page apps are still very widely used, and they're still a very valid choice. And so when you just say, use a framework, it doesn't really give you guidance on the right technical approaches for choosing tools. Is a framework like Next really the best thing for a beginner? What if you don't have Node on your back end? There was also, the initial docs had a line that said, if you don't want to use a framework, we can't stop you. And the phrasing was kind of awkward. And it took them a very long time to eventually add Vite as a docs listing. They've said that the docs page are aimed at beginners, but it's also true that what you list in the docs is a stamp of approval. And so the docs ought to reflect the real-world options that are being used. There was a whole big sequence I was involved in earlier this year where Create React App broke, and eventually we managed to convince the React team to announce that it was dead and provide some migration paths. A lot of argument back and forth there. Eventually, they ended up with some docs pages that had a new building a React app section, which listed Vite and some other tools as options. And I'm actually very happy we got there. It also took us too long to get to the point where those were listed as valid choices. There is some great information about server components available online. There still really isn't much info in the actual React docs. It's really very lacking. And so one of my takes is that the core docs really need a lot more info on what are server components, how do they work, when and why should I use them. So wrapping up, unfortunately this whole Vercel invented server components thing we're kind of stuck. It's probably not going away, but it is wrong. Please don't argue with that one. React will still work the same way. It's not going to change. You can still use it the way you have already. But the push for frameworks has been a little too over-focused. There's a lot of valid ways to use React. I would love it if the React docs had a lot more info on server components. I also, as a maintainer, I understand that the team is very busy trying to build things and they don't have a lot of time to write a lot of new docs. And the fact that we are seeing server components come out in other frameworks like Waku and React Router, I think is going to help because there's more options and they aren't just Next. So hopefully that has helped answer and clarify some of the confusion. Like I said, I don't care what you use. I just want people to understand how did we get here and be able to make decisions for yourself. I have, as usual, a ton of links and more info in the slides and on my blog. Also, please feel free to come by and ask me questions, and I'll happily rant for half an hour. Thank you.